Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. On behalf of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, UNCTAD, and other partner organizations, we would like to welcome you to this session, which is part of the Global Services Forum, having sessions yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And this session in particular will discuss the important issue of how to promote the participation of developing regions in global information and communication technology enabled services trade. The specific objective of this session is how to increase the understanding of crucial factors and policy interventions that drive developing countries' successful participation in the IT-enabled services trade. We would like to separate both domestic policies but also for policies related to foreign direct investment and the facilitation of international trade in services. And we will also looking into factors that are related to the pandemic and how the pandemic has been changing some of these crucial factors. And to start this session, I would like to please give the floor to three participants for the opening remarks, starting with Mario Castillo, Director of the International Trade and Integration Division, of which I am also a member. My name is Nano Mulder, and I'm heading the International Trade Unit within that particular division. Please, Mario, the floor is yours.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be on this opening. Dear Mr. Wilfried Wex, Director of Regional Program of Alliance for Democracy and Development with Latin America of the Konrad Adenauer. Dear Mrs. Jambes Remy, Director of the Trinidad Rampal Center at the University of West Indies, and distinguished member of the panel and other participants of this webinar. Let me start to say that the topics that bring us together today, it's of great relevance for the Latin America and the Caribbean countries. The service facilitation by the information and communication technologies or modern services have accelerated their growth during the COVID-19 pandemic worldwide. Since 2020, the digital transformation of firms and the government has accelerated, partly due to mobility restriction. We observe in the region new asymmetries and a digital economy at 3 speed. Leading country on one side, average country, and also leading countries in the digital economy. It's urgent to close digital gaps between countries and consolidate the regional digital strategy. Today, the region represents only 2% of the world export of these services. The participation is much lower than other services, such as tourism and trade in goods. That is between 5 and 6%. The region must promote modern services and export to diversify the economy and export, taking advantage of the fast rising demand of this demand activity. In the current context of the recovery, digital transformation and the services to support this process take on even greater importance. The consolidation of the regional digital agenda acquires strategic importance under the ILAC 2022 agenda coordinated by ICLA, the country of the region seek to deep the regional digital market. To this end, government are promoting a strategy that streamlines cross-border electronic and digital commerce, but integrating digital infrastructure. Also promoting the harmonization of national regulation, guaranteeing the free flow of data with respecting current regulation of each country, fostering trade facilitation, improving postal and logistics services, and promoting regulatory framework that leads innovation in the digital payment services. Also, the formation of the network of research and policymakers around the promotion of the services sector and its international trade in Latin America and the Caribbean, called REDLAS, has also been important. It would like to acknowledge in particular the support of the CAS ADELA program to the REDLAS activity. Today panel review some of the key factors for the development of modern services based on the experience of countries inside and outside Latin America and the Caribbean. In Latin America, Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic form two interesting cases in this area. The experience of the other countries in Africa and Asia, and also reviewing. In addition to national policies, the export success of country depend on trade, foreign direct investment, tax agreement. Without going into detail, I would like to highlight some critical factors that have emerged from the work at ICLAC and its partners. These include support COVID-19, include digital transformation, such as modern services, e-learning, telemedicine to increase diversification. Accelerate and deepen both national and regional digital market. Increase investment and regional integration for modern and resilient transport and logistics. Invest in improving the skill and competence of the workforce to take advantage of the growing demand for modern services. Increase public and private collaboration to create an attractive ecosystem and cluster for both investment and national supportive of modern services. Harmonize the regulation of trade services in all countries. And finally, improve the measure of trade services and electronic commerce to better design, monitoring, and evaluate promotion policies of this sector. Several of these factors will doubly be highlighted by the panelists. I wish you an excellent webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mario, for these opening remarks on behalf of ECLAC. And now I'd like to pass the floor on to Winfried Weck. Winfried is the director of the Regional Program Alliances for Democracy and Development with Latin America, the ADELA program of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung based in Panama. Please, Winfried.
Muchas gracias, Nano. Ayer en el High Level Forum hablamos todos inglés, entonces voy a cambiar hoy al español. Déjenme comenzar primero con darles la bienvenida. Buenos días, buenas tardes a todo el mundo. Yo no quiero entrar en la temática, solamente quiero mencionar que estamos muy felices de estar aquí con UNCTAD, con REDLAS. Con REDLAS ya tenemos una larga historia, especialmente referido a la organización de los encuentros anuales de reglas, como con la CEPAL, ECLAC, y estamos muy orgullosos de tener esa cooperación. Yo solamente quiero mencionar una cosa. Acabo de leer que según el conocimiento actual de la paleontología, el ser humano necesitaba 1 millón de años, estimadamente 1 millón de años, entre usar las primeras herramientas y manejar el fuego. 1 millón de años. Yo comencé mi trabajo, mi vida profesional, hace 29 años como asesor para cooperación técnica y desarrollo en la sede central de nuestro Partido Demócrata Cristiano. Cuando yo hubiera recibido la invitación a esa conferencia con ese título, la participación, es tan difícil traducir, la Participation of Developing Regions in Global Information and Communications Technology Enabled Services Trade. Yo hubiera preguntado a todos mis colegas de qué se trata y nadie hubiera tenido ni idea. Esos son 29 años. Siempre hay que pensar un poco y tener en mente cómo ha cambiado el mundo, con qué rapidez en los últimos 2, quizá 3 décadas, y no va a ser más lento, va a ser más y más rápido. Esto solamente como un pequeño pensamiento cuando leí 5 veces el título, y yo espero que tenemos una muy interesante discusión. Los panelistas están de altísimo nivel, entonces ya esperamos que tenemos una muy buena y interesante conferencia. Muchas gracias y saludos desde Panamá.
Thank you very much, Winfried, for these remarks. And indeed, this is a very timely session in a sense that these services have emerged in a very short time. And as you said, 3 decades ago, we still didn't have the internet, or it emerged in the 1990s. So you're right, the world is changing very fast. Now I would like to give the floor to the 3rd member of the panel opening this webinar. And in particular, I would like to pass the floor on to Ms. Jean-Yves Remy. She's the director of the Sridhar Rampal Center for International Trade Law, Policy and Services of the University of the West Indies. Ms. Jean-Yves, the floor is yours.
And thank you very much. All protocols having been observed, let me just say that on behalf of the SRC and more broadly the University of the West Indies, how pleased we are to be part of this forum. And before I hand over to the main event, which is the panelists, I just wanted to take advantage of this platform to say a few words about the role of the university and really highlight some of the issues confronting the Caribbean as we talk about this issue. So the Caribbean islands are services economies, and services account for around 65% of our GDP. Our import and export markets are dominated by transport and travel services, and to a lesser extent, recreational services and professional services. A recent ECLAC report explained that the Caribbean is losing market share, with the travel sector experiencing a 2.2% growth as opposed to global rates of 5.5%. And telecoms declined by 2.6%, where global exports actually rose by 21.6%. So the picture for the Caribbean, and I dare say Latin America perhaps, is one of an undiversified, stagnant services economy. So how do we pivot and transform our economies with the challenge and opportunities provided by ICT? The literature suggests that there are three main ways that ICT-enabled services can improve the Caribbean's export prospects. Traditional services can be enabled by the new technologies, so take our tourism product and splash some AI and digital platforms and virtual reality into it and create a new product. Second, we can talk about traditional goods being bundled with services as part of a new consumer offering. This is popularly called the servicification of trade. And third, there are entirely new services created by these technologies that never existed before. So platforms where we use to sell services and goods through streaming of music, transaction payments, these are all new services with their own independent value. Where does the Caribbean stand in this whole new economy? And why are we not seeming to reap the full benefits that immersion into the knowledge and digital economy promise? It's not because of lack of talent. I was on a panel yesterday with some of the young entrepreneurs that are leading the Caribbean in this field. What we collectively in that panel surmised is that we in the Caribbean are lacking the right enabling environment. And I'm anxious to hear from those economies like Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic of how they got their economic ecosystem regulatory framework correct. Some of the problems in the Caribbean relate to the fact that many of our ecosystems, aspects of our developmental sector for ICT are dominated still by outside interests. Software industry, for instance, all of the region's tax, social security, and licensing departments spend more than $100 million plus a year. And all of this is being spent in order to buy the services of foreign suppliers. The telecom sector that remains largely unregulated can still charge extortionary rates that cannot support a truly developmental agenda for the region. Second, we lack the proper harmonized legislative and regulatory frameworks to protect our users, but also enhance the interoperability of ICT infrastructure across the Caribbean. Third, we lack the proper access to finance and credit. Some of the barriers that plague the successful integration of our export services are still the ones that plagued our services economy for a long time, such as lack of sector-specific regulations, lack of proper competition rules, outdated rules that prevent the free movement of persons, inadequate skills training, and innovative policies. In short, in my view, a revolution in the ICT-enabled services economy can only happen if we first treat with the domestic reforms that have to be put in place. And what can a university like the one I am part of do to enhance that ecosystem? We must prioritize education methods that teach our students how to contribute to the development agenda of the world they inhabit. Research that not only follows and studies the global trends, but also offers practical-oriented solutions, whether through a clinic that can help an MSME enter a new market, or through an innovative incubator lab that have proved so successful in many top-class universities around the world. So as I close, the task for this panel is monumental. I am looking for answers for the Caribbean of how the Caribbean and other small developing economies can position ourselves to take advantage of the international global value chains and services. How do we value the export potential of these services, and what is the added value of ICT? What kind of domestic reforms and international policies do we need for developing countries to participate fully in the ICT space? This morning, as we examine the factors and policy interventions driving developing countries like the Caribbean, I urge us to be deliberate, and focused in our recommendations and interventions. Once again, thank you, and over to you, moderator.
Thank you, Genevieve, for these very provocative but very honest remarks regarding the challenges the Caribbean and Latin America at large are facing to participate better in the IT-enabled services trade. And now I would like to pass the floor on to the moderator of our panel session, which is Mr. Tom Azopardi. He is a Bloomberg correspondent based here in Santiago, Chile. Tom, thank you so much again for having accepted the role of moderator, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Nano, and thank you, Mario, Winfried, and Genevieve, for your remarks, and thank you everyone for joining us today on this panel. My name is Thomas Azopardi. I'm a special correspondent with Bloomberg Industry Group. As we've heard, the purpose of today's event is to examine the trade in information technology-enabled services, which have proved much more resilient to the pandemic than traditional services exports such as tourism and transport. However, developing regions are lagging behind in this rapidly growing trade in services, accounting for less than 1/4 of global ITES exports last year. So today we want to look at the experience of developing countries in facilitating modern service exports. What are the factors which explain their success? What are the main challenges holding them back? And what can countries do to emulate the frontrunners in terms of attracting foreign direct investment, developing the necessary skills in their population, supporting small and medium-sized enterprises, and putting in place the right regulatory framework? Also, what role have international agreements, free trade agreements, and double taxation treaties played in facilitating the development of this trade in services? To discuss these important issues, we have 4 global experts in the international trade in services. Joining us from San Jose, Costa Rica is Vanessa Gibson. She is Head of Investment Climate at the Costa Rican Investment Promotion Agency, CINDE. From the Dominican Republic, we have Elena Rosario, Director for Trade Policy at the Ministry of Industry, Trade and SMEs. Rupa Chanda is Director of the Division of Trade and Investment and Innovation at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP. And finally, we have Dipali Fernandez, is a researcher at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, who has advised developing countries on their trade policy. Okay, so during the time we have today, I'm going to put a couple of questions to each of the panelists, but there will be some time for questions from the audience at the end of the session. So if you have a question that you would like to put to the panelists, please send them to us via the chat facility in the over the platform. Thank you. So to start off our session, I'd like to put a question to you, Vanessa.
Good morning.
Good morning. So I want to ask, Costa Rica has been very successful in attracting foreign direct investment over the last 2 decades in order to develop a modern services export sector. In fact, in the decade to 2017, I read modern exports of modern services from Costa Rica grew more than 4-fold to almost $4.5 billion. So can you tell us a bit about how Costa Rica has achieved this astounding growth?
So thank you very much for the question, and it's a pleasure to be here. So we started back in the early 80s with a strategy to attract foreign direct investment and to actually diversify the fundamentals of our economy that was actually based on agriculture economy. And by then, the decision of the country was to focus on what was not natural to Costa Rica, which was high tech. And in that regard, actually, we started back deciding on establishing a framework, which is the free trade zone regime that is a law in Costa Rica. It's a very straightforward tax regime incentive package that we offer to companies, and was very much aligned with what at that time was basically, tax exemption, corporate income tax, and so on. Actually, when we started back in the early 80s, this regime did not include services as an activity that were benefits. So it's not until around year 1998 when we had a couple breaking ground companies arrived to Costa Rica. Actually, 6 companies arrived to Costa Rica prior to that change, which were at that time Sykes that acquired an Acer operation. We had LLB doing back offices. We had also Amadeus, and we had Equifax, and Procter and Gamble arrived as well with the first shared services, along with Western Union. And at that time is when we decided, well, these companies will also require some some incentives to actually, start building up. And it's very interesting because by year 2000, even from our central bank, we did not have national accounts representing any other services out of tourism in our activity. So it was out of that 6 new companies that arrived that we start promoting services. What has been the opportunity for Costa Rica? It's talent. Actually, the service industry has grown significantly above all other industries in the country. Today, generating over 100,000 direct jobs in country. We are 2.5 million inhabitants in terms of our labor force, being the most dynamic sector right now generating jobs. And by the way, the strongest in terms of number of new projects and reinvestments to country. So CINDE has been able to attract almost 200 companies to Costa Rica at this point. Something that is very interesting for us, obviously, has been the challenge of keeping up those enabling factors that promote, attract, and retain these companies. One very interesting feature is that Costa Rica has been by far unsuccessful attracting companies that wants to use Spanish as their language. Actually, our 4 top languages that we are providing services out of the country are English, and on top of English, Portuguese, French, and German today. So we are considered a multilingual corporate service hub, which actually on the side of investment climate is very interesting because now we have to enforce the communication from the industries to government and other stakeholders in order to really create the right conditions in country. And obviously, much of that initiative and much of that strength of transformation drives through our talent development strategy. So we have to become a multilingual site because of the type of services. Costa Rica is known for being a very specialized service provider as well. So sophistication of processes is actually constant. So nowadays, the mix of talent requirements of skills and knowledge that companies are seeking in Costa Rica is part to the transformation of digital transformation, of disruptive technology. So we started back then with customer support, which we no longer have. And now we are pretty much in the face of companies growing significantly on data scientists, high computing engineering, etc. Because the strategy of the companies in Costa Rica so far has been to attract first-phase transactional processes, but very fast. In over between 2 to 3 years, companies transform and start attracting more sophisticated, higher value-added processes. So talent has to be, matching to those requirements. In the last 2 years, obviously, things has changed significantly for us. Pandemia, basically, as in every other case, has just, bring all these enabling needs and gaps upfront and very much intensive in terms of how much we need to change, because Costa Rica has seen actually the highest growth of investment and talent demand in the last year. We are now conceived by many of our companies as a business continuity site. So now they are transferring more operations to Costa Rica to balance their risk around the globe. And this has basically just stressed a little bit more at the fact that we're still not a bilingual location. We're still striving to become a multilingual. So, the efforts on talent development is even more intensified in the last 18 months. We are actually working with several organizations, being CINDE, a non-for-profit organization, working with directly with the government, Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Education, and so on, because right now we have foreseen actually a higher rate of growth expected this year in terms of talent demand in our country based on these expectations of growth that the companies has. Connectivity definitely has been an opportunity as well as a challenge. We had to turn around more than 180 companies last year to have fully work from home settled. So it was a very interesting time for us. We were able, many companies in 3 days was able to transfer 100% of their workforce to work from home. And this has actually paid off for us in the sense, as I said earlier, now we're seen as a very stable, resilient location where they're actually expecting to continue to grow and actually balance this risk that they have globally. So now working with government in order to get better connectivity in even extended rural areas, because work from anywhere has become a natural sense for us here in Costa Rica. So we are getting not just the employees of companies moving out to different areas, but also talent coming from abroad to establish here and also work from anywhere from Costa Rica. So connectivity is another major challenge that we are facing. So we actually at CINDE, it's very clear that the effort of the government in terms of building the right conditions are relying strongly on education development, which not necessarily falls on the traditional concept of education. We are actually going through a shift of paradigm from traditional educational system and knowledge transfer to lifelong learning type strategy, where we need to retool, reskill, upskill. I mean, all the skills that we can, try to develop. And there is where we're working hand to hand with companies. For us, it has been traditional to work with the companies and actually connect with government. Now we are actually trying to strengthen that communication that needs to flow in a much faster and easier way, because companies today are not just hiring, they are training, they are developing programs, they're doing a lot in terms of how they are building up the talent that they're needing. So we need to transfer some of that knowledge also to our academia, also to our government officials, etc. So that's the role that CINDE is playing right now. How much of the global experience that is happening around with non-traditional educational platforms such as Coursera, Udemy, all these nano degree certifications and so on. Now we are actually being very aggressive in country in order to build up these programs. We are running several pilots. We have tested us directly in coordination with companies, several of these platforms for language skills, for technical specialization certifications, and others in order that we could cope in terms of how fast companies are expecting to find new talent in market with these new skills and actually transform the talent they already have within. So we are seeing this COVID and post-COVID era as one of great opportunity, obviously great challenge, because to move the fundamentals of a structure of an educational system of a country takes a lot more time than what the market is requiring. But we are having these constant conversations and presenting to government models that have been proven, at least at pilot level, that actually justify much of those changes that we expect.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Vanessa. That sounds like it's very exciting to be working in your sector at the moment. If I can turn to you, Elena, in the Dominican Republic. In May this year, the government of the Dominican Republic launched the country's first national strategy for modern service exports. So could you tell us some of the main elements of this strategy and what the country hopes to achieve with the development of this strategy?
Yes, thank you, Tom. Bueno, I would switch to Spanish.
Okay, no problem.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Un placer para mí estar aquí en este panel con todos ustedes. Agradecer a CEPAL, a UNTAC y a todos los organizadores del evento por invitarnos a compartir con ustedes. Partiendo de la premisa del efecto dinamizador que tiene el sector de servicios modernos y sobre todo el potencial en la economía local y mundial, la República Dominicana cuenta con la primera estrategia nacional de exportación de servicios modernos, la cual fue lanzada el pasado 5 de mayo de 2021. Es una estrategia que tiene como objetivo mejorar las competencias de los recursos humanos, modernizar los aspectos normativos e institucionales a través de la creación de iniciativas que fomenten la atracción de inversión extranjera directa, lo cual estimula la creación de nuevos servicios, promoviendo también a los mercados internacionales y aprovechando los beneficios establecidos en los acuerdos comerciales que la República Dominicana tiene vigente. La estrategia cuenta con 5 pilares fundamentales, los cuales van desde desarrollo de capacidades. En este pilar se describen los procesos que permiten mejorar las competencias y habilidades de los recursos humanos del sector, combinando la formación para el empleo y la competitividad, el desarrollo de habilidades blandas y la capacitación continua y actualización de conocimientos para incrementar la productividad laboral y el fomento a la innovación. Como segundo pilar, tenemos en la estrategia los aspectos normativos e institucionales, lo cual define políticas, estrategias, regulaciones, instrumentos normativos para tener una mejor gobernanza del sector, generando sistemas de información para la formulación, seguimiento y monitoreo de algunas estrategias o políticas o incentivos que pudieran mejorar y apoyar el desarrollo del sector de servicios modernos. Un tercer pilar es el de inversión y financiamiento, donde se contempla el abordaje de las políticas, iniciativas y acciones públicas y privadas que favorecen el acceso al financiamiento del sector, incluyendo el diseño de productos, financieros especializados, captación de recursos para el desarrollo de la estrategia y mecanismos de operación público-privadas. Como un cuarto pilar de esta estrategia también está el ecosistema, que aquí creamos las condiciones de un entorno de valor agregado, un estímulo a la investigación y el análisis de tendencias globales en el sector que permiten incorporar elementos de vanguardia y creación de nuevos servicios y su actualización constante para el reforzamiento del sistema del comercio de servicios. Como un quinto pilar está la promoción de mercados, que va orientado a la definición de estrategias y análisis, acceso y consolidación en la participación en los mercados internacionales, incluyendo estrategias focalizadas en nichos específicos, integración a las cadenas globales de valor y atracción de inversiones estratégicas para la exportación y aprovechamiento de los acuerdos comerciales vigentes. Estos esfuerzos que hemos estado realizando para llevar a cabo esa estrategia han traído como resultado iniciativas numerosas, como por ejemplo, pudimos establecer 5 mesas sectoriales, las cuales están sobre temas como economía naranja, que ahí incluimos las industrias creativas y culturales, tanto los sectores y subsectores. También tenemos una mesa de estadísticas que se encarga de recopilar y levantar toda la parte de datos estadísticos en comercio de servicios, junto con todas las instituciones que son recolectoras de datos. También tenemos una mesa sobre logística y transporte y servicios profesionales, que también incluyen todos los sectores y subsectores que tienen este entorno económico. Y por último, tenemos una mesa de tecnología de la información y comunicación, que igual que las demás tiene todo un sinnúmero de sectores que incluyen un espacio de consulta, de levantamiento de información, pero también de coordinar las acciones que hay que hacer para hacer efectiva la implementación de la Estrategia Nacional de Servicios. Realmente estas mesas sectoriales han sido de mucho provecho para la República Dominicana, porque ahí se han dado la congruencia de muchos sectores en los cuales pudimos determinar cuáles eran las necesidades, cuáles eran las limitaciones que tenían y cómo pudimos también ver los desafíos que afrontaban esos sectores y hacer una estrategia que diera resultado a esa necesidad que esos sectores tenían y a a ese entorno económico global que estamos ahora mismo aportando. Hay también el proceso de ese levantamiento de información y desarrollo de las mismas consultas. Hicieron con más de 40 instituciones que estuvieron con nosotros, sector público y privado, acaparando más de 10 sectores y subsectores, dentro de los cuales pueden destacarse cine, moda, animación, diseño gráfico, softwares, videojuegos, call centers y BPOs, servicios logísticos, artes visuales, artes escénicas, música y todo el servicio profesional que incluye a muchas profesiones. También realizamos consultas en modalidades de entrevistas virtuales y presenciales a estos sectores que componen las 5 mesas sectoriales. Y obviamente todo ese trabajo también se hizo en el marco del Comité Nacional de Servicios que tenemos en República Dominicana, que es un órgano institucional que compone instituciones del Estado, donde aquí pudimos tener ese encuentro público-privado donde nos dio las herramientas para poder tener una estrategia con éxito. También hicimos capacitaciones impactando a más de 150 personas de diversas instituciones públicas y privadas a nivel nacional e internacional. Tuvimos un webinar también con mejores prácticas internacionales y por lo que podemos decir que esta estrategia es un antes y un después para nuestros sectores, lo cual lo estamos enfocando a que se puedan desarrollar a nivel local para que puedan exportar y acceder a todos los mercados internacionales, llevando el talento dominicano a todo el mundo. Muchísimas gracias, Tom.
Muchas gracias, Elena. Sounds like a very promising program. Thank you for sharing it with us. Now, Rupa, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, despite the success of countries such as Costa Rica, Latin America lags behind other emerging regions in the development of the service export sector, especially when compared to some economies in Asia. Could you give us an overview of the digital services trade in the Asia-Pacific region? Not only who are the main players, but also what are the key factors in developing the sector and what role governments have played in facilitating its growth?
Thank you very much. And I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Yeah, so if you look at the Asia-Pacific region, actually it is the most dominant region among the developing countries. Just to give some statistics, if you take the sub-regions of East, Southeast, and Central and South Asia together, they account for $700 billion worth of digital services exports, or 97% of developing countries' exports, and 21% of global exports in 2019. These are UNCTAD statistics. And within that, if you look at ICT services exports, they're $576 billion in 2018. And that's a huge increase from where they were at the beginning of the 2000s. So really, they are the dominant player, as you've mentioned. And of course, there are certain countries like India, China, Philippines, which are really the major players within this, India and China in particular. What's interesting, actually, is the heterogeneity within the Asia Pacific. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is that there is space in this sector for a variety of countries to participate. And this is based on a study that I recently did of 6 selected economies in Asia Pacific, which are very different. So I had India, China, Philippines, Indonesia, Mongolia, and Fiji, to kind of capture a variety of countries in terms of, landlocked countries, Pacific Island countries, and so on. And of course, the scale of exports for these 6 countries was very different, but I think they really capture the essence of this kind of export that provides opportunities for a wide range of developing countries. So now if you look at, for instance, the scale for India, right? We are talking about close to $200 billion. But you look at a small country like Fiji, you're just sitting at some $46 million, but even then it's significant because it's creating employment. In terms of the composition also of the basket of exports, it's quite different. So for India, it's really all through the spectrum. So you have business, professional, computer information services, financial services, call center, and then you're also getting into value-added sort of services. When you look at Philippines, you have animation, healthcare outsourcing. So, they're leveraging certain strengths that they have. China's is a very different case. So I'll just give you some specifics. I think it will highlight very clearly how countries can engage in this area. One other very important thing to recognize is, ICT services are sort of two-way. For most countries, we'll be seeing that both exports are growing and imports are also growing. So there's a very strong connection between imports actually facilitating exports and imports of certain kinds of services like business and professional services. It's extremely important, I think, to be open. And so this is also a message that countries need to get, that you can't take the mercantilist sort of approach that a surplus is good and so on, because you might need imports to facilitate the exports. Now, so let me give you a sense of the profile. So for instance, take India. As I was saying, you have financial engineering, R&D, market research, etc. But then you also have emerging areas like AI and automation. There's also a clear shift towards startup-based exports in areas like edutech services, homegrown digital enterprises, which are actually acquiring overseas entities and diversifying into other digital services, expanding their subscriber base in overseas markets. So we are kind of seeing, in this country at least, a shift from call center and routine BPO services to more knowledge-intensive sort of applications of digital services. In Philippines, as I mentioned, we're seeing a range. You're seeing animation, game development, medical transcription, engineering, design, back office in the accountancy services. They're very strong in that area. So India and Philippines, I would say, are deriving their competitiveness from things like skill availability, their cost advantage, and niche in certain services. China is a very interesting example because actually China is not competitive in the services space. It's actually competitive in the manufacturing space, but it's leveraging its manufacturing competitiveness to actually give digitally basically embedded services. It's a servicification kind of exports that we are seeing in China. So its strength in digital exports is coming from cross-border exchange and processing of data, and the growth of its digital economy in general, because China is one of the biggest digital economies today, competing with the US, and growth of digital trade, which is e-commerce. So basically, its ICT services exports are to some extent piggybacking on the growth in e-commerce and its manufacturing trade. So that's a very interesting sort of space, because China is different, I think, in that respect from the other sort of traditional ICT services exporters. The other interesting thing with China is it's an exporter of capital even in this space. So, you find Alibaba, for instance, is the largest shareholder in Paytm, which is India's largest mobile payment service. And financial has minority stakes in digital payment services in many countries in the region. So basically, you can also think in the GATS sort of framework that Mode 3, which is the export of capital, the investment part, it's an exporter of services through investments. And that's again actually enabling its e-commerce trade in the region. It's investing in startups and various digital technology platforms in the region, and those in turn are leading to regional exports by those countries. So that's another very interesting dynamic. Then when one looks at a country like Mongolia, what's very interesting, it's a small country, doesn't have a huge amount of manpower, but it has a lot of talent in science, engineering, mathematics. And you have Japanese and Korean companies which are actually interested in this market. They're using the small market there to try out pilots. They're testing applications there. And some of the entrepreneurs there are actually using that expertise to then export to other regional markets. So Kazakhstan, for instance, Turkmenistan. So this is something that came out from primary discussions in Mongolia, that actually they are serving as a test case, and they are using that learning experience to become regional exporters for other landlocked countries with very similar sorts of geography. Fiji is, of course, more of a traditional sort of digital services exporter. It's call centers, back office services, mainly for Australia and New Zealand, but it's strategically located. So they're also trying to get into the markets in North America because of their position, the time zone advantage.
Ms. Rupa, apologies for interrupting, but could you please speak a little bit for the interpreters?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. So now let me talk about the enablers and constraints. So it's actually very similar to what the previous speakers have mentioned, because if I look at it across the experiences of these different countries, I would say there are 4 broad pillars which are enablers, or the absence of which is a constraint. So there's human capital and related aspects of skills and expertise. Second is telecommunications and digital infrastructure more broadly, and various aspects which capture digital readiness. Third is the innovation and entrepreneurial environment, like the presence of digital enterprises, startup culture, R&D activity. And fourth is the business environment. It's overall sort of ease of doing business, but it's also about regulations specific to e-commerce, data protection laws, data localization, and so on, digital taxation. So it's these four. So if we look at each of these pillars, I think the interesting thing that came out from this study is that no one pillar is sufficient. You have to have certain thresholds, but most probably I would say human capital, the skills and talent part, and on the other hand, the business and regulatory environment, these are probably the most important things without which a country cannot really enter into this area. So if we take the human capital part, so some countries are basically leveraging scale, like India, and the cost advantage that comes with it. Some are looking at specific skills. So what emerges very clearly is that, many countries are just lacking the domain knowledge and the very specific sort of expertise that this changing technology are requiring. So they're not able to keep up to date. Even a country like India is falling short in terms of skills and expertise in some of these emerging domains. Some countries, of course, just don't have the scale, so that's an inhibiting factor. On the digital infrastructure part, it is actually, of course, the basic part is connectivity, bandwidth, and so on, but it also goes beyond that. It's about the quality of it, and it's also about things like data storage. So, with countries coming in with data localization and those kinds of policies, having low cost data storage and data servers which are efficient becomes very important. So I think one of the things that I learned from the study is that you need to think beyond just, what is available in quantity terms. It's both a quality issue, and then there are many emerging things within that pillar. So in this case, in digital infrastructure, it's about data servers, for instance. That's something that's still not so much on the radar of countries. On the innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem, the kind of laws that you have for startups, the tax incentives that you give, all these play a very important role. And you have countries like China, which are actually having a lot of pilot zones where they're trying out applications, and then if they work well, then you expand them. So an environment which enables failures, entry of new business models, that's extremely important. And one of the things that emerged from the study is that absence of such an environment, like we found in the case of Mongolia, you don't have targeted policies for startups. You don't have fiscal incentives. You don't have a competitive procurement process to award contracts to startups and new digital enterprises. Those can become inhibitors. And finally, on the ecosystem, I think this is where actually a lot more work needs to be done, because it's, as I said, not just about ease of doing business, it's the importance of transparency in regulations, ease of data transfers, open trade and investment regime, and supporting investments. And this is where a lot of countries are actually still evolving. Some of them don't really even have legislation. They just have some pending bills. So this is something that could potentially, if not done well, could potentially undermine the opportunities that are there, especially for the upcoming digital enterprises. There are also many other enabling sort of factors like soft factors, mindset, behavior, adaptability. There are issues of, how MSMEs can integrate and the access to finance. So there are a whole range of other things which are also enablers, or lack of which are constraints. Now, finally, let me just talk about the role of government. So because, it's both certain inherent things that countries may have enable them to participate, but there are also acquired advantages. And so governments really do play a very important role. So if one looks at the evidence on what governments are doing in this region, largely they're very facilitative. Most of them have some sort of national strategies or roadmaps to develop the digital economy, to expand telecom infrastructure and connectivity, and so on. But I think where there seem to be gaps and more needs to be done, for instance, in the area of human capital, I think still not enough seems to be there in terms of looking at cognitive skills, the softer sort of skill sets that are needed in this changing technology world, or adapting the curriculum, or coming up with some sort of innovative or very focused and targeted skill-oriented programs. Those don't seem to be there. Rather, very long-term sort of education policy changes seem to be more the way governments seem to be approaching it. And I don't think that would work given the fast pace at which technology is changing and the kinds of skills that are required in ICT services trade. On the regulatory side, I would say the picture is very mixed. Governments are focusing on reducing regulatory burden and compliance costs, but on issues like data transfers, data localization, digital tax, I think the trend, at least in Asia Pacific, is more protectionist. This could potentially affect ICT services exports in future, especially financial related, data transfer related exports. It could force MNCs to have to redesign their technical infrastructure and co-locate servers in host country data centers, which would mean fragmenting operations, leading to higher costs. It could hurt startups, it could hurt scalability. So I think a lot more work needs to be done on this, and there is a need to discuss like what kind of data is sensitive, what needs to be localized, what can be easily transferred across borders, thresholds on taxation. So really overall, I think the message is that there is room for a variety of countries to participate, but government has to play a very important role, and it's like a complex ecosystem with 4 very important pillars that have to be supporting ICT services trade. I'll stop there.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Rupa. That was fascinating. Interesting to see the variety of experiences of countries in Asia in developing modern export services. I want to turn to you now, Deepali. You've advised several countries about exporting services. Could you share some of your observations on developing countries and information technology enabled services exports, drawing on examples from Africa?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to UNCTAD and ECLAC for this invitation to participate in this panel discussion. I'm not an expert on Africa, but I'll try and draw on my experiences working with SADC and COMESA and other countries in the region.
Okay.
So, yeah. So the first thing is, basically, we all know, as Rupa mentioned, of the importance of IT-enabled services for developing countries. And to me, post-COVID and the technological developments that have followed as well, this has now been leapfrogged a lot more into the future. And I think this sector, to me at least, will be an extremely crucial one, something that has been reflected by various speakers today as well in the opening statements. In terms of Africa specifically, the government, the private sector, telecom growth are 3 factors which have actually contributed to a growth in services exports. So as of 2019, I think it was about 6 to 10% of total services exports were linked to ICT technologies for most African economies on an average. The fastest growing sectors related to this are trade and retail, financial services, and healthcare. And these 3 industries have basically driven the growth of the, Pan-African is a bit of a generic term, but in bits and pieces throughout Africa, the BPM and IT-enabled services industry. So for instance, if we look at banking and finance, you have the demand for IT-enabled services like data management and storage, security, customer services, and investment into the fintech sector has surpassed other sectors, tech-related sectors, since 2016. Telecommunication is another area which, in the case of Africa, especially mobile telephone communications, has been a big success story, as we all know, in sub-Saharan Africa, because the number of mobile phone subscriber bases rose 6% of total population in 2004. From there, it rose to 44% in 2018. This, in turn, has fueled demand for IT-enabled services such as financial services, commercial transactions, just retail buying and selling using your mobile phone, so on and so forth. Healthcare is the 3rd sector, and here you find IT-enabled services linked to information systems, data centers, and customer support. So the countries that have focused on building up their capacity nationally and also to attract multinational corporations are basically Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, Madagascar, Mauritius, Morocco, Nigeria, and South Africa. Some of their business is linked to what has been outsourced from global clients, given the linguistic commonalities in the case of, for instance, Morocco with France or Madagascar with France, and also a very favorable time zone for the European Union, the United States, and the United Kingdoms. What does this mean structurally? Structurally, you see what you would consider thriving outsourcing industries in Mauritius, Morocco, and South Africa. And you also see a fast-growing ecosystem of technological parks, innovation hubs, and support infrastructure in Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana, to name a few. Again, as we know, for IT-enabled services and developing countries, one of the key factors are essentially internet connectivity and ICT infrastructure. And if we look at both these indicators, in the case of Africa, outside of mobile phone penetration, internet penetration in Africa has been low compared to other regions, in particular Asia. But mobile phone penetration internet penetration has been extremely high across the continent. And a recent IT report in 2019 pointed out that Africa has the fastest growing mobile economy in the world. So there is a big potential over here, as it also links to other areas like e-commerce, financial transactions, so on and so forth. ICT infrastructure is an area where there can be a lot more progress. And here we have the countries that have an interest in the industry, that have developed, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, that have developed their ICT infrastructure, but there are several other countries that lag behind, but are looking at public-private partnerships to develop this, Mali and the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance. I think Rupa spoke a lot about the enabling environment, and in the case of Africa, this enabling environment has been a mix of different components: incentives, access to finance, skills, upgrading of skills, greater private sector partnerships, SEZs, and regulatory environment. Skills development is an important point that Vanessa also made as something that will be crucial going to the future. And I think this was a point that Nano had made in 2020 in one of his presentations, where he quoted a World Economic Forum statistic that said that basically 54% of people will need to be upskilled in the future going forward. And an interesting example within the Pan-African context out here is a project implemented by the African Development Bank and Microsoft called Coding for Employment, which currently involves 5 countries: Kenya, Rwanda, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and Nigeria. And here what they've done is create a range of different IT-related courses and classes and made them available online, by phone, and through physical presence. One of the key impacts of all this move towards ICT-enabled services, IT-enabled services, has been a huge jump in financial inclusion, which is a big development benefit for the continent, because the number of adults that had access to financial services grew from 170 million in 2012 to 300 million in 2017. So this is a big jump, which is largely attributable to mobile phone usage and linked services. In terms of opportunities, I think Rupa made a very important point on heterogeneity. Diversification was one of the key reasons why developing countries have been considering IT-enabled services, to diversify away from traditional sectors of agriculture, manufacture, in the case of Africa, tourism and construction. But an added benefit is also the value add and enhancing the traditional sectors as well. So for instance, if you have agriculture, which is a traditional sector, how can you link it to providing information services linked to commodity pricing, for instance? So this kind of, building up the traditional sectors while also building up your inherent strengths, whether it's human capital or whatever. A second consideration is to look not just, services exports externally as in outside the region, but also within the region, and also at your own national markets for your own consumers, basically. I mean, Yaniv talked about building up national competitiveness, and I think this is important. I mean, COVID has taught us one thing, and that's that we can do a lot of things online, whether it's health, schooling, education. A lot of things can actually move online. Second thing that has also been mentioned is regional and global supply chains. MSMEs are crucial. In Africa, 85% of people are employed in the informal sector, and a large proportion of the informal sector is SME driven. So involving SMEs is crucial. And a last point would be basically the potential of diaspora. One of the key factors in the success of the Indian IT sector was basically the Indian diaspora who came back with investment, who came back with technological transfers, skills, so on and so forth. Africa has a very highly qualified diaspora that resides outside the country, and it will be important to leverage that diaspora for investment, for skills contributions, for a range of different areas, whether physically or even virtually. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dipali. That's very interesting, and sounds like there are huge opportunities in Africa in the development of modern services exports. Can I turn back to you now, Vanessa? We touched on this in your first answer about the effect of the global COVID-19 pandemic on the service export sector in Costa Rica. But obviously, this has taken the COVID-19 pandemic has taken the importance of the internet to a new level for many people. What are you looking at? Is Costa Rica looking at new opportunities in the export of modern services now in this? We're moving beyond the post-pandemic.
Yes, certainly. I think, as I previously said, we have this wave of that we think it's a wave. Actually, it's the wave of the positioning of the country as a safe location. So business continuity is bringing more business, and not just the traditional processes that we have at these companies, but nowadays more and more sophisticated. So with that in mind, we are planning and actually understanding how companies are actually rethinking their global strategy. So, companies are rethinking their business model. They are reshaping the way they are entering markets. So that will actually require that different settings of the processes that they might want to shift to different locations. And with that, the mix of talent that they are looking for, where we see much of the stress right now. So we are actually, not to say we have already a plan settled, because actually we're trying to understand there's a lot of uncertainty. When you go back to your corporate contacts, they're still figuring out what they're going to do globally. So to say specifically in Costa Rica, it's still blur. So what we're doing is actually going also reading out what's the signaling that we are finding in the markets towards technology, towards knowledge, towards different areas, how companies in broad industries are approaching, and also taking advantage. I think in the region, there is this new wave of a strategy of the nearshoring, right? Of activities that might seem in the most of the cases related to manufacturing, but we have seen over time that when you promote manufacturing, simultaneously you're bringing also services operations and high level services, engineering based, et cetera. So building up on what we're seeing abroad, we have several, and it's actually a very interesting feature that we've been experiencing. Aside from corporate services, Costa Rica has been, I would say, successful as well in attracting medical device manufacturing and also what we call advanced manufacturing. And right now, they are now one of our biggest opportunities, because these companies in the manufacturing sector are also diversifying, are also building up their digital strategy globally, and it's actually using their existing platforms or existing locations to now start doing a little bit more of engineering and a little bit more of design and etc. So we are following a little bit those trends, which, as I said earlier, the challenge is that there's nothing clear out there right now. Even though consultants and so on are still hesitant in terms of aligning where we're going. But for sure, we have some good examples internally. And just based on the opportunity that we have to work with the companies that are already there from different industries and sectors, has helped us actually to figure out, I would say, some initial first steps in terms of engaging more aggressively, not just to work with, for example, our local academia, but nowadays for us, we have to diversify. We have to go out and start working with academia abroad and working with non-traditional academic platforms, etc., because things are happening so quickly, as we know. So in this point in time, where we are trying to target our efforts and basically the impact of this COVID and all this transformation is actually rethinking the fundamentals of the enabling factors that the country offers. So it's all, for example, tax exemptions and tax incentives, probably not. There's a lot of discussion either way. This huge discussion abroad with the minimum tax and all that is building up a lot of momentum. But then we're going to have to rethink our capacity of building up incentives that are non-traditional in our case, which might fall away from the our traditional tax exemption regime. And most of it obviously linked with the talent development strategy that we definitely has to have. Costa Rica is just 5.1 million people. So, size, yes, that's matter in our case because our market tend to be saturated every so often with the number of jobs that are arriving with the specific skills that are needed today. And companies are being, as I said also earlier, very innovative in the way that they are training and retooling people. So we have a lot to learn directly from companies and also translate that to the rest of the economy. So there is where we are right now. I think, yes, the pandemic will put us somewhere very different that we planned 2019. We were not near where we are right now. And actually we are still, as I say, fuzzy in terms of the highlighting where we are in the midst of starting a new government term by next year, which is also challenging in terms of the huge transformation in terms of regulatory and investment climate itself. So we definitely need to be very sensitive of signaling reading, of following through, understanding directly the needs of companies. Nowadays, talking directly to companies is the safest strategy that you can have, and also working with them to find solutions to major problems.
Okay, great. Well, it sounds like the pandemic has changed everything in our lives, and we still haven't worked out where things are going to look like afterwards. So I understand the challenges you're facing.
Great.
Elena, I want to ask you about in the Dominican Republic. You've already had some significant success developing exports from the creative sector, particularly in the film industry. I was interested to read that as far back as the second Godfather film was partly filmed in the Dominican Republic. So can you tell us what lessons can be drawn from your creative industry for other sectors, other service export sectors?
Claro, la industria creativa se ha constituido en una oportunidad para todos nuestros talentos con vocación artística, cultural y de investigación, quienes han podido generar desarrollo y crecimiento económico a través de sus ideas. Nuestro país ha logrado una importante transformación de su canasta exportadora, pasando básicamente de una especialización de bienes primarios a una basada en servicios. Y es que para el 2019, ese sector de servicios representó el 59.7% del Producto Interno Bruto, lo cual se constituye como el mayor peso de nuestra economía, con exportaciones que van desde los 9.345.6 millones, según estadísticas del Banco Central. De estas, las industrias creativas y otros servicios modernos representaron el 12% del total de las exportaciones de servicios, por lo que nuestro país da pasos muy firmes a la inclusión de todos nuestros sectores a la economía internacional. Y esto es en especial el caso del mercado cinematográfico, que gracias a la facilitación otorgada por la Ley 108-10, se han realizado 350 producciones audiovisuales extranjeras, más de 15.000 millones en inversión extranjera directa y más de 2.500 empleos directos. De acuerdo con un estudio del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo BID del 2018 sobre economía creativa en América Latina y el Caribe, en la República Dominicana contamos con 2.042 empresas de ese sector, las cuales están divididas en 650 de artes visuales, 494 de educación cultural, 380 de audiovisual y radio, 371 de empresas de libros y publicaciones, 87 de artes escénicas y espectáculo y 60 de música. Lo cual podemos evidenciar que con la Estrategia Nacional de Exploración de Servicios Modernos que hablaba anteriormente, pretendemos justo eso, abrir puertas a un abanico de nuevas oportunidades dispuestas para el desarrollo de los talentos nacionales e impulsarlos al mercado internacional, apoyando de esta forma los servicios tecnológicos profesionales y, claro, los de la industria del conocimiento y creativo, desde diseñadores gráficos, cine, audiovisual, videojuegos, entre otros. También el país ha estado trabajando en diversos proyectos que fomentan el desarrollo de la industria moderna. Entre ellos, tenemos un registro de proveedores de servicios con el cual estamos haciendo un levantamiento de información sobre las empresas y personas que quieren y pueden exportar servicios a fin de disponer datos que nos permitan apoyarlos en el acceso a los mercados internacionales. También pusimos en marcha un programa de Empaga tu Talento, mediante el cual incluye información, capacitación, coaching directo a empresas para ayudarlas a exportar su conocimiento a los fines de establecer alianzas que puedan aprovechar mercados a nivel regional. También pusimos en marcha el programa Dominicana Creativa, a través del cual estamos apoyando a las industrias creativas y culturales con ejes de acción que incluyen data y medición y también un estudio de impacto económico de la industria de cine y diseño de dashboards sectoriales. Parte de estos desafíos más importantes que lo tenemos en la economía creativa es la inserción de tecnologías digitales emergentes que conllevan una transformación profunda de los modelos productivos y de consumo. En respuesta a este reto, el Ministerio de Industria, Comercio y MIPYMES coordina el grupo de trabajo Economía Digital dentro de la Agenda Digital 2030 de la República Dominicana, desde el cual estamos elaborando propuestas de acciones que garanticen justamente la incorporación de tecnología a todos los sectores productivos, incluidas la economía creativa. Y obviamente esto en conjunto con los esfuerzos de fomento y promoción de los servicios modernos y muy específicamente de las industrias creativas y culturales. Muchísimas gracias, Tom.
Gracias, Elena. It's very interesting to hear all the variety of creative industries that are being developed in your country. Now, I wanted to turn to you, Rupa. Information technology has obviously been critical for developing modern services exports. So what can countries do to leverage IT to increase these kind of exports? And also in the Asia Pacific region, how important have trade agreements been between countries or groups of countries for facilitating service exports?
So actually, you know, one of the interesting things is all these enabling factors that we are talking about, the investment in the digital infrastructure or skilling, creating a better business environment. I think what happens naturally is not only does that promote the exports of these services, but in turn it promotes the growth of the digital economy, more inclusive sort of business models. It helps startups. So the sort of spillover, the tangible, intangible, direct, indirect, you know, there are just so many spillover development benefits that can come from the growth of this industry. And that's really what the governments need to try and leverage. If you just look at some of the sorts of gains that countries can make out of this, one is obviously directly employment. I mean, you see the direct employment in the sector, but there's a huge amount of indirect employment in all the supporting sort of activities that go with the ICT-enabled services thing. And, you know, here you're talking about range of skills, talking about real estate, catering, hospitality, you know, maintenance, hardware, and so on. So, and there's a lot of evidence out there, at least for the Asian economies. I'm more familiar with the Indian case, for instance. If you're talking of, say, 4 million people being employed directly in the industry, some 10 million people are being employed indirectly through all these supporting activities. Then you have in terms of the use of this infrastructure that's created, these entrepreneurs who come up as a result of this business, in terms of connecting to remote areas, bringing products to customers in different parts of the country. So I was looking at the case of Indonesia and how the growth of these digital enterprises, which are exporters in the regional market, but then they're also linking up with suppliers in remote parts of the country, which is so spread across so many islands. And they're basically enabling market inclusion and geographic convergence. So, there are these, and then this infrastructure, of course, can render itself to things like financial inclusion, access to education, health, government services. So the point is really that for governments to recognize this sort of synergy between the what should I say, the growth of the digital economy and the spillover sort of public good and social good benefits that can come from it, along with the exports that can be generated from that. Of course, there are challenges because, we know about the digital divide issues and, that certain sorts of people with skill sets or MSMEs and so on might be left out, but this is not inevitable. So it really is a question of how governments are able to spread digital awareness, how much they can provide access to digital infrastructure across geography, income, age groups, gender, social strata, and across types of businesses to small businesses. I think it's that perspective that governments need to have. And it's also a question of how well they're able to integrate the adoption of digital technologies, basically in different sectors of the economy. Dipali gave the example of agriculture, right? How you can actually use the digital platforms to inform farmers regarding commodity prices. And there are so many such examples of how you can actually utilize the digital technologies that are enabling the ICT services exports to improve efficiency in public utilities, for instance, in the agricultural sector, the healthcare sector. I'll just give an example. Take telemedicine exports. Okay, so a lot of corporate hospitals are doing that. Now you can say it creates a digital divide between the affluent urban population and the foreign patients who are coming if it's exports. But you can use the same infrastructure through a PPP mode. You can actually tie up these corporate hospitals with remote areas. I've seen a few of such hospitals who are actually doing this, and they're able to serve poor people in, provide the basic diagnostics and so on. So it's really a question of how we integrate the ICT services related ecosystem with the rest of the economy. Now, coming to your question on trade agreements, I think because this is really a very tricky area, I would say, because in the multilateral trading system, we're making no progress. And increasingly, the regional trade agreements and the plurilaterals are kind of taking over this domain. But even there, if you look at the RTAs, for instance, you really have a whole range. You have those which have standalone e-commerce chapters. They're looking at digital rights management and CPTPP sort, and then you have the much looser ones like RCEP in this area has some commitments on data flows, but it has so many exemptions to these commitments. Its digital trade chapter is exempt from the dispute settlement chapter, so effectively how enforceable are the commitments, we don't know. So going ahead, I think it will be important to keep 5 things in mind in trade agreements. Because interoperability of digital systems, frameworks, standards is going to be critical for businesses. And what we are seeing today is different countries are adopting different sorts of standards. This is not workable for global businesses. And it's going to be very difficult for the small enterprises also, because they'll not be able to integrate with the larger companies. So what are the things we need to keep in mind? I don't think I have a solution as to what trade agreements can deliver, but they certainly need to keep in mind access by small businesses in trade. They have to look at ease of data flows. I think we need some conversation regarding what kind of data flows need to be restricted for national security or consumer privacy. What are those principles? I think it's an agreement on principles that we need. Digital tariffs, because the moratorium on e-commerce. So I think this is an issue that has to be resolved in the plurilateral context, and then maybe scalable multilaterally. But there are key holdout countries like mine, India. Digital financial services, I think the commitments on digital financial services are crucial because they underpin a lot of the transactions that are going to happen in ICT trade. And of course, the commitments that countries make in terms of the market access conditions. So I think RTAs should focus for now in terms of just cooperation, exchange of information, and trying to arrive at some sort of standardization of frameworks, and this is where I think they need to involve the companies It cannot be just a government-to-government dialogue. What was just said, talking to industry, understanding its concerns, understanding what should be those thresholds for which businesses, beyond what turnover level taxation would apply. OECD is doing some work. I think there's a lot more dialogue that's required. It's a very sensitive area, and unfortunately, I don't see it progressing very quickly in the near term. I think it's going to be difficult because you have big countries, dominant players in this area. China has a very different position. It's going to be hard to bring them to the table. So I will not even try to attempt to say, but these are the things that must be taken into consideration in the RTAs.
Okay,
thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Rupa. That was very interesting. It sounds like trade negotiations are going to remain a challenge for the world going in the coming decades. So, but Deepa Lee, I wanted to ask you another question on a similar issue. I mean, how important have these the issue of service exports been in the trade agreements that are being negotiated? I mean, among the emerging markets that you're watching. I mean, for example, in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, are issues that affect modern service exports being resolved in these agreements?
Well, I mean, I think, like Rupa mentioned, it's a tricky area. And there's really a lot, and I mean, a lot of constituencies. I mean, wherever in the world you are, I mean, whether it's the WTO or regional, wherever in the world you are, and the stakes are so high as well, that this is really a kind of a, I would agree, a tricky area at this point in time. But I mean, if we take something as simple as, what are we talking about? We've talked about ICT services, ITES services, e-commerce related services, computer related services. So just the terminology differs in different fora, in different places with different people. So I think the first thing would be, just to take stock and understand the concepts and how they apply before, looking at it in the trade negotiations context, and also the implications of these concepts, because just the terminology alone has implications for classification, what you're going to be committing to, the trade negotiations, the sectors, the subsectors, policy, the applicable regulation. So the impact when you come to the actual negotiation side of things is actually quite big. So there is a need to, I think, one, understand what we're dealing with. Secondly, I think there needs to be a certain degree of coherence, because right now you have disciplines on both at the WTO and at the regional level with the ACFTA context, disciplines on e-commerce under discussion. You also have potentially disciplines on domestic regulation in trade and services under discussion. So there needs to be a certain degree of coherence between the different discussions within the WTO or within the ACFTA, and then again within the regionals and the multilateral, so ACFTA and WTO, because you have the same membership basically, and there's a overlap. And I would say the same thing of any RTA in any region. I think another area is, we always talked in the context of IT-enabled services, we always talked about modal interlinkages. And we said mode 1, which is cross-border services, is how ITES is traded. And that's closely linked to mode 3, which is investment, and closely linked to mode 4. Do we now need to revisit and look at what these implications are, not just from a trade negotiation perspective, but also from a trade policy perspective, to understand post-COVID and with newer technologies, what does this mean exactly? A second area is in terms of labor movement. You have, a certain degree, at least in the past, of IT-enabled services was linked to movement of people who move to perform contract jobs, experts, so on and so forth. So how does that sit in with the commitments being made on mode 4, which is movement of people, and also, for instance, in the ACFTA context, you have a freedom of movement protocol. So how do these trade agreements and the movement of people protocols sit together is another thing. And innovation, I mean, we have, big data, blockchain, artificial intelligence, all with huge transformational potential on our lives and specific services subsectors, healthcare, agriculture, education, and government services. But what does that mean in terms of trade policy and trade negotiations? In terms of technology transfer, in terms of what we're negotiating on again. How does it change the object of what we're negotiating exactly? And then in the ACFTA context, I mean, again, speaking as an observer, an external observer, I mean, I think the ACFTA offers a big opportunity to the region. And things are moving very fast over there. I mean, the trade and services agreement was concluded. There have been several rounds of negotiations that are underway. There are 5 priority sectors, out of which 3 are linked directly to IT-enabled services, business services, telecommunication communication services, and finance. And I understand that both an e-commerce protocol on digital trade is under discussion, and or negotiations will be initiated, and the same thing for investment as well. And there also talks about setting up a pan-regional payment mechanism for the region, which would be important as well. And I think there's a pilot that will start in Western Africa, from what I understand. So there's a lot that's happening, and there things are moving fast. But I would agree with Rupa, the whole discussion on the negotiation aspect is a bit tricky at this point in time.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Dipali. That was very interesting, and sounds like it's a dynamic but a tricky, sensitive issue to discuss here. Thank you very much to all our panelists, to Vanessa, Elena, Rupa, and Dipali, for sharing your insights on this fascinating topic. I feel we've covered a lot of ground, from Costa Rica to Fiji, and from human resources to world trade negotiations. It seems like there's a great deal that countries in very different parts of the world can learn from each other about how to take advantage of this growing trade in modern services. And so thank you everybody for your time in participating and listening to our panel today. Nano, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Tom. Thank you so much for moderating this excellent panel. And now we are going to take a couple of questions from the floor, from the participants, and they can be addressed to different panelists. The first question, which is directly to Vanessa Gibson of Senior, and actually a question from Scarlett Bonder, asking what impact from the pandemic has Costa Rica seen in the ICT-enabled exports? I know, Vanessa, you've addressed a lot of issues of the opportunities and the challenges the pandemic has raised for Costa Rica, but if you can give us some specific insights on how the ICT-enabled exports have been going up or down during the pandemic. So can you please comment on that issue?
More than happy, and thank you for the question. Yes, we actually had a peak of our exports in the ICT sector. Actually, we already get to the $6 billion exports. It's been a constant growth, and beyond what we were expecting, probably a slowdown in the last year. We actually had a significant increase of the level of exports in our services industry, as well as the level of employment, as I mentioned earlier. So we are also expecting, based on our estimations for this last 2 quarters, that we probably will have a significant increase, continued significant increase in the level of exports of ICT industry. That is compensating, obviously, the impact on our tourist industry, which has been severely impacted compared to previous levels pre-COVID, and the local activity, but mainly industries such as agriculture and transportations and so on. So the external sector for us is what balanced much of the continuity of growth for the country. So we are seeing a much, I would say, very important increased numbers for advanced manufacturing, medical device manufacturing, and mostly from the ICT industry for us.
Excellent, thank you, Vanessa. And we have another question from the audience. I mean, this addresses an issue that you mentioned as well, that the importance of consulting with companies when you're developing the regulations for the modern service exports. Do you also consult with civil society organizations, such as consumer groups or privacy advocates, about the new regulations that you're developing?
Yes, we have well, we work with different silos of topics and so on, especially when we think about regulations for the labor market and so on. We are actually partnering with not just, the companies that we're seeing what their needs, but also validating that with the rest of the economy. So, these regulations would actually enforce the conditions of the country in general. So we work with, and we consult with chambers and with other social groups and civil groups as well to make sure that, we are seeing both. Sometimes what is the challenge is that probably the trade and investment sectors goes a little faster than our local economy. So many of these changes are a little bit disruptive for some of them, especially when we talk about labor changes, talent development changes significantly. There's a huge gap between what the local market is needing or expecting from what we are needing on the other side of the industry.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
So, Tom, if there are a few other questions coming from the audience, and
okay.
one question we may ask maybe Rupa to respond is with regard to I will read the question, which is the following. Data localization does not seem to have harmed Chinese startups or scalability. Startups in developing countries mostly sell their digital solutions to big platforms. So how can governments make sure the country benefits from startups? Even if data localization does harm startup scalability, governments requires data to be stored locally for other reasons because they have to consider other factors beyond startup scalability. For example, the EU's General Data Protection Regulation. Australia requires data to be stored locally for privacy reasons. New Zealand requires tax data to be stored locally so it can be checked for tax evasion. The United States requires defense data to be stored locally, etc. So many examples of countries imposing regulations regard to local storage. Do you think governments should give up all these policies that require data localization because the only policy they should have is what helps startups scalability? Rupa, can you address this issue, please,
Yes,
from the
sure.
Asian context?
Yeah, so I think I was not trying to say that governments should not have any sort of regulations concerning data flows or what can be localized. What I was trying to get at is there needs to be a bit more harmonization or convergence across countries. Because today businesses are very global, and you do have smaller businesses who have tie-ups with the larger ones. So it becomes difficult if you have so many countries with so many different standards. So the principles of localization, of what is classified as sensitive data. So what I was trying to get at, we need to have some understanding, or maybe another way of doing it is to have what is called regulatory assurance between companies. Maybe not always go at it from a government to government point of view in terms of matching of legislations, which will not happen. Obviously, principles may converge to some extent, but the body of the legislation and the provisions and so on will differ depending on the sensitivities of countries. So never am I saying that national security, consumer privacy, none of these are concerns. But see, if GDPR is a constraint, now how do you get around the constraint? Well, you have the safe harbor between the EU and the US. Are there ways, mechanisms of working it out? Can you work it out B2B? So that's what I was trying to get at. And in terms of, benefits, I think we have to change the way we look at benefits. If the startup is selling its solutions to the larger platforms, it's fine. But those applications are also there for benefit of local consumers. It's not always that it's purely for export. So some of the applications and services that are developed can also benefit, in terms of local education solutions, health solutions, financial inclusion solutions, and so on. So you need to create that environment that the rest of the economy is in a position. That's the point I was trying to make, that you can integrate the other sectors and people have the capacity, they have the digital awareness, they have the connectivity and so on to also benefit from this. So it's not about cross-border e-commerce. It will also benefit the retailers within the country and the consumers within the country. So that's the way we need to look at benefits. And benefits are not just about, taxing the transactions and getting some revenue out of it. That's another big area, of discussion, which is digital taxation. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Rupert. It's very interesting to hear your point of view on that issue. And there's another question here I'd like to put to Dilapi. It says, developing countries and least developed countries can export workers via Mode 4 in services trade. What North-South free trade agreements do you know of which have enforceable significant new Mode 4 market access for developing countries and least developed countries to developing countries, including visas for workers, including unskilled and skilled, with recognition of their qualifications?
Yep. Thanks, Tom. I mean, Mode 4 we know has always been a sensitive issue at the WTO and elsewhere. So, in the North-South context, I'm not sure of more recent agreements. There are some, I think, more with the bigger developing countries in the northern context, and I'm guessing those are based on pure commercial interest, essentially as a trade-off. They're mostly linked. The commitments that are made over there are mostly to high-skilled workers and in specific subsectors. In the South-South context, on the other hand, again, in the WTO as well, there's the LDC services waiver, which also made a reference to Mode 4, but because of the Doha development round and how things have kind of stalled right now, everything's a bit on hold. In the South-South context, we have, for instance, again, within the African context, you have both COMESA as well as the ACFTA have a standalone freedom of movement protocol, which is not at this point in time directly linked with the trade agreement. But the idea is that it would encourage, to begin with, movement of people linked to business, linked to commercial interest, and then move on to other areas. So, yeah, so I think it's a good question. It is a sensitive area. And I think countries are, in both the North-South and the South-South context, a bit wary about making binding commitments. What would be interesting to look at is the bilateral labor agreements, because here, since they're not completely binding, but are normally best endeavor, there tends to be a lot more flexibility, and that would be interesting to actually look into.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much then. Thank you, Dipali. So that seems to bring the end to the questions from the audience. Thank you for all the questions from the people who've been listening to the panel, and I'd like to, and it brings to the end our panel today on developing modern service exports from developing countries. I'd like to thank all the participants today, Vanessa, Elena, Rupa, and Dipali, and well, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this panel today.
Thank you so much, Tom, for moderating this panel. And in the agenda, just this, to close this webinar, we are still within time. I would just address some closing remarks on the main takeaways of this session. And I think it has been a fascinating review of trends in different developing regions, both from Latin America, from Asia, and also from Africa, regarding the main advances and also the challenges. I just would like to give some highlights of the main contributions from our panelists. And it was fascinating to hear Vanessa Gibson providing insights from the experience of Costa Rica. And Costa Rica has been a very successful exporter in Latin America and the Caribbean. Actually, it is the largest per capita exporter of modern services in Latin America. But as Vanessa has been saying, Costa Rica is a very small country of only 5 million inhabitants. So within the region, it is it's part of the largest exporters, but of course we still need to scale up the exports of modern services of other countries in Latin America to make the region really a significant player at the global level. And I think Vanessa has very clearly spelled out what are the opportunities of the pandemic for Costa Rica to move forward. but also she highlighted the very important challenges that this pandemic is raising for the future of Costa Rica in modern services world trade. And this is particularly linked to the retraining and the reskilling of people in working in the modern services sector. And as we know, the landscape of modern services is changing very fast. So for the country to remain competitive in this area, this retraining and reskilling is very urgent. And in that sense, a combination and collaboration with universities, with vocational schools, to make sure that the curricula are being updated is absolutely crucial. Now, from the Dominican Republic, I think we heard very interesting oversight of the actual plan that is being implemented to boost the participation of the Dominican Republic in modern services world trade. The participation of the Dominican Republic is still small, but they stand out in two particular sectors. One is the call center sector, which is already quite developed in the Dominican Republic, and also Elena has highlighted the important participation of the Dominican Republic in the cultural services sector, and in particular, the Dominican Republic has become a very attractive location for the film industry. And she has mentioned also some of the plans and the very important public-private collaboration that is ongoing to make sure that the Dominican Republic can reap the benefits of the changes going on in the modern services industry moving forward. Now, we had a very interesting presentation and comments by Rupa Chanda from UNESCAP. And of course, Asia is really the most important developing region. Just let us remember this huge imbalance among the three developing regions, where Asia is accounting for 97% of developing country exports, and developing country exports only account for 21% of global exports. So in that sense, there's still a lot of room to increase the participation of developing countries, and in particular, developing countries from Africa and Latin America that combined only represent 3% of developing countries' exports. And I think what Rupa has highlighted is that this large diversity of services that are being traded and room for many types of players in this very diverse range of industries that are available. And she's commented in particularly on the very different range of services being offered by India, the Philippines, and China, whereas where India and China, India and the Philippines are more present in services that are really exported as services, whereas in the case of China, they are an important player in the digitally embedded services that are part of manufacturing product exported to the rest of the world. Now, she highlighted also the importance of the innovation, the business environment, and the regulatory environment that play a crucial role in making sure exporters can really develop their products and services and sell them in other markets. And it's the combination of this complex ecosystem that makes or breaks the success of exporters, and in particular also of startups and SMEs that often play a very important role in the innovation and the upscaling of the country's participation in this type of trade. And of course, the role of government is very crucial, but as she also pointed out, it's very important to have like this continuous engagement of the government with the private sector to make sure that the countries can really thrive in global trade. Now, I think Deepali's remarks have also been very important, and although Africa is still a very small player together with Latin America in this type of services trade, I think some very positive messages come out from the presentation, in particular, that the very fast uptake of the use of mobile phones, smartphones in Africa really present a tremendous opportunity for different types of services related to retailing, e-commerce, banking and finance, health-related services that are really growing very fast. And even Africa is the developing region that is showing the largest growth rates in the last few years in these types of services. And I think also a very interesting remark was the potential role of the diaspora, of the African communities in Europe, in the United States and elsewhere, that can play a very important role in bringing capital and knowledge to the African countries to make sure that their growth really gets to the full potential. And I think finally, to wrap up the very important role of trade agreements, which we have addressed as well, and the very sensitive issue of labor mobility that still continues to be a very difficult area for many countries. But I think with the pandemic, we've seen that also the virtual mode can replace to some extent the importance of mode 4, labor mobility. But of course, that doesn't mean that the very important opportunities of both skilled and unskilled workers in the services sector is a very important area for developing countries to really leverage and benefit from modern services trade. So to the extent labor mobility could be included in future agreements, and foreign workers will be allowed to work in elsewhere in the south or in northern countries, it would present a major opportunity for developing countries to increase their participation in modern services trade. So these are my final remarks. Again, I would like to thank Tom, the participants, and also those that have made the opening remarks of this session for their excellent contributions. I thank you so much, and we look forward to the following sessions of the Global Services Forum, and I thank you again for your participation, and I wish you a good rest of the day or the evening. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.